Hello and welcome to the CTS panel discussion on millennials and the church. We had some technical difficulties getting started, so we're a few minutes late, but we wanted to get started and we have one more panelist joining us. I'm Andrew Osborne. I'm the content specialist here at Concordia Technology Solutions, and I'll be hosting this discussion. And I'm joined today by Hannah Osborne, Katie Munson, and Daniel Ross. And if you guys would mind introducing yourselves and explaining who you are and what this topic is about for you. So Hannah, let's start with you.
Okay, hi everyone. My name's Hannah Osborne. I am a recent college graduate, and I worked a lot with millennials when I was in college. Obviously, I am a millennial, but I was a student leader at my campus ministry, and so I spent a lot of time talking with other millennials about our faith and leading Bible studies, planning events, and things like that. So I'm really interested and passionate about learning about millennials and kind of what we like in our faith and things like that.
Awesome. And Katie, what about you?
Yeah, I am a 2011 graduate of Concordia, Nebraska, and I serve as a DCE in Rockford, Illinois, and I get to focus, along with some other educational things, on communications. And with that and family life stuff, I am very passionate about how millennials and other generations interact and what we can learn from one another and how we can grow in that.
Great. Well, thank you, and I'm glad you guys could make it today, and hopefully Daniel will join us within a few minutes here. If not, we'll get his reactions on some Twitter or something like that. But let's start out with some questions. So I have some questions that I'm going to ask you. Let me pull those up here. And all right, there's you guys. That's Daniel, for those of you who don't know him. Hopefully he'll be popping up soon. But for the first question, let's talk about some characteristics. So what are some common characteristics of millennials, and what are some common stereotypes of millennials that may be incorrect? So Katie, why don't you kick us off with this one?
Boy, all right. So just from what I've read and stuff, I don't know that I actually knew that I was a millennial until I was a freshman in college, and in a general studies class we started looking at generations. But a lot of the characteristics that we commonly hear, we do like technology. That's one of the reasons that we're here today, or kind of build a conversation around. We also really value community and just relationships and authenticity. I know some of those, but it's probably definitely add to that. So, research this book and everything.
Katie, you seem to be breaking up just a little bit. I don't know if your connection's bad. While you take a look at that, Hannah, why don't you answer this question as well? What are some common characteristics of millennials?
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what Katie said. I think millennials are really all about relationships with other people. That's something that I've just really seen, is that we really care deeply about having those deep connections with other people. That's something that's really important to millennials. I think that a really common misconception about millennials is that we're apathetic or aloof or just kind of uncaring, and I just haven't seen that to be true in my experience anyway. A lot of the millennials I know are really passionate about a lot of things, and when they care deeply about something, they're going to dive straight in and go all in. And so I think that a lot of people think that because of, like Katie said, of our tendency to like technology and things like that, that they think we're kind of aloof. But I just think that that's not true, that millennials, yeah, we are technologically savvy, but I also think that we're really caring and passionate about the things that mean a lot to us.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think you hit on a lot of good spots. I think millennials are very into technology, but I think it's easy to box them into that sometimes, whereas they're much deeper than just that.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, so millennials have different experiences than those of different generations. So what societal factors have influenced your life and development, and how are these factors different from those people, or from those of people in other generations? Hannah, what do you think about this one?
I think that the biggest kind of societal influence on millennials has really been kind of just living in this era of tolerance. That's kind of a buzzword now, I think. Millennials, a lot of us have grown up in this age of where you're supposed to be accepting of everybody, you're supposed to love everybody, and everybody can believe what they want as long you can believe what you want, but as long as it doesn't affect me, then we're good. And so I think kind of growing up in that era has influenced how we interact with religion. It's kind of hard for us to find that line between, okay, we want to love everybody, but we can't accept everybody because the Bible condemns certain sins, and some people are living in sin. And so I think it's really hard for us to just kind of live in this culture today and find that line and still standing up for what we believe in and maintaining those strong beliefs. But then also, growing up in this age of where we're supposed to kind of tolerate everybody.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. What do you think, Katie?
I agree with that, pretty much exactly what Hannah said. I don't know that I could add much to that. It is that fine line, and I know within Christian circles we will hear the phrase a lot, speaking the truth in love, and I think that is something that we're really having to dig into, figuring out how we do that practically.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. By the way, if you're watching this at home or on YouTube and you'd like to ask a question, you can always go to Twitter and use the hashtag CTSPanel, and we'll try to get some responses to your questions. So keep an eye on Twitter as well as this video. For the next question, we're going to talk about technology's influence. So how does technology influence your life as a millennial, especially when contrasted with people of other generations? Katie, what do you think about this one?
This is something that I have always found kind of funny. I'm on the, like middle to older end of the millennial range. So if we're going to use the language I've heard in academic circles about being a technology immigrant or a technology native, I'm somewhere in the middle. Like, I remember when we got our first PC at home and all you could do was play Oregon Trail on that. I also remember as a 10-year-old watching Xenon Girl of the 21st Century and seeing their video, chatting devices and thinking, whoa, that's crazy. But, I have one. So it's kind of crazy to think about the influence that's had, both knowing a world that wasn't so connected and valuing that, and then also relating to all of the benefits and hazards that technology may have on the way we connect. But as far as like how we interact with different generations, it's always funny to me because I'll find people who are older than me that are probably more technologically savvy and connected, and then I'll find younger people who almost, I think, are burned out because this is what they've grown up in, and so any opportunity to disconnect is valuable.
Yeah, it's almost like technology is less special for those of us who grew up with it, whereas I've worked with pastors who haven't grown up with technology, and they ask for help from me, and they just seem so excited to get to use it. Yeah, I think you're right with that. Hannah, what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, I agree with basically everything that Katie said. I think that it's really interesting because a lot of people think that millennials are like so addicted to our phones, or we can't go without them, and obviously that's true for some people, right? And like I have my phone with me at all times, but I also know a lot of people in older generations, like people like my parents' age who are like baby boomers, who are also always have their phone on them, are on Facebook all the time, and that's not necessarily a terrible thing, but I think that people kind of like to bash millennials, saying that, we're kind of alone in our love of technology, but I think it's just kind of a societal thing in general. And so, yeah, we're more adept at it, and we're definitely really good at using technology. And maybe we prefer it in settings where, some older generations might not, like, for example, the church. But I definitely think that it's more, we're not as attached to it as people think we are.
Yeah, you see a lot of younger people on their phones all the time, but I don't think it's more so than those of older generations. I think it's just that's where our society is today, and that's what everybody's doing. But because the younger generation kind of gets viewed more, uh, maybe it just appears that way.
Yeah.
By the way, Katie, it seems like we had the same childhood because I remember watching a lot of those and playing the same games and things. So, yeah, I guess that's kind of another common millennial thing.
Yeah. Yeah, kind of on that, I don't know if this relates, but how technology has shaped popular culture, and that's a connecting point for a lot of us. I mean, that's, I think, why BuzzFeed is so popular, because we see these things and there's this nostalgia and this connection, and oh my goodness, you watched that too, and and those opportunities for that.
Yeah, some of my favorite BuzzFeeds are the ones where it like shows 90 things that you did in the 90s or something like that.
Yes.
I think the nostalgia, like you said, is what really connects us. So, in your experience, what is the general perception among older generations regarding millennials in the church? Hannah, what do you think about this?
I think a lot of people think, kind of like I touched on earlier, people think millennials are kind of aloof and just uncaring and very apathetic. And like I said before, I just haven't seen that to be true. I think that when given the opportunity, millennials really rise to the occasion, and they really take on a lot of responsibility, and they're willing to work hard and be passionate about what they love. And so I think that, you know, a lot of times millennials are kind of the underdog. People don't think that, you know, they can handle certain tasks and things, but I just think that if you give millennials a task and a responsibility, they'll rise to the occasion, and they'll really do what needs to be done.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. What do you think, Katie?
Yeah, I would agree with that. Hannah's words. I think when, you know, preparing for this, I asked a couple of people. So when you hear millennials in the church, what do you think? And I do think that there's a common perception that millennials want to be entertained, and I would counter that with we want to be engaged, which I think a lot of people do. And we use technology, but not as this, not as the end itself, but as a means to that end. And sometimes that expresses itself differently than others.
Yeah, I think that's right. I know that as a millennial who goes to different churches, a lot of times I feel like maybe because people still view me as a younger person, they feel like they need to cater to me and not let me be as involved. Do you get that perception at all for you guys?
Yeah, I see that, and I have a little bit of a different vantage point being a church worker. So people know that I'm involved in the church and want to be, but just from my peers and stuff, seeing that things that I've been involved with, like I said, I love intergenerational things and learning from those younger and those older than me, and from my peers as well. But sometimes I find that we segregate age groups, and there's some data out there actually that's pointing to that not being the most healthy or productive way of doing things. And so I think that plays into what you were saying, Andrew.
Yeah. Hannah, do you ever get that impression that because you're younger, people don't want to give you as much responsibility, or they feel like they need to take care of you more?
Yeah, I definitely get that feeling sometimes. I think the biggest thing for me is that the church kind of easily gets stuck in this, you know, we've always done it this way type of thing, which, you know, is not necessarily wrong or bad or anything, but I think millennials, more than any other generation right now, are more likely to have ideas that are kind of out there or different or kind of challenge the status quo. And so I think sometimes millennials feel hesitant to express those ideas because, you know, they're maybe afraid that, you know, they're going to be shot down or not listened to. And so that's kind of the general perception I have of it. But, I think it's kind of that fine line between, okay, holding on to these important traditions and values, but also recognizing what's important to the congregation.
Yeah, I think that. Oh, go ahead, Katie.
In holding on to those traditions and those values, explaining why and encouraging the asking of questions and critical thinking and why we do these things. Like Hannah said, it's not necessarily bad that we've always done things this way, but let's dig in together and find out why we've always done them this way. And I think kind of perceptions are changed the more conversation and thinking we do.
I think that's right. I know in my personal experience, I really love the traditions of the church, but I also, if I don't know why we do them, they don't mean as much to me. So having someone explain them can really open up your eyes to why we do certain things certain ways and make them exciting again.
Absolutely.
So when millennials are searching for churches, what do they typically look for? Do you guys have any ideas? I know, Katie, you work for a church, so you probably haven't looked around for a church in a while.
Kind of a package deal.
Yeah, but you probably know some people that have looked for churches and have an idea of what they're looking for. So what do you guys think about what they look for?
So I'm at the unique point in my life where me and a lot of my peers and friends are, starting new careers and moving, and so we are searching for new churches at this point. And so I talk about that with my friends, kind of what we're looking for in a church and things like that. And honestly, the thing that most of my friends and the millennials that I talk to, the thing that we look for, the two main things I think are that the church is gospel-centered and that it's going to stay focused on Jesus and that it's going to be biblically sound. I think that's kind of maybe surprising for some people that that's the first thing that millennials look for in a church. They would think like, oh, fancy lights or contemporary music or a praise band. But honestly, the thing that we look for most is that their beliefs are consistent with the Bible. And I think the second thing is opportunities for us to engage in the church and especially connect with other people our age. I know Katie was talking about intergenerational things, which are really, really cool and valuable. But I also think there's a lot to be said for connecting with people who are in your same shoes and who are going through the same things that you are. And so in my experience, those are two of the things that millennials look for most when they're trying to find a new church. And worship style also does play into that. I think we might touch on this a little more later, but a lot of millennials do prefer contemporary worship, in my limited experience anyway. And so while that's not maybe a deciding factor, I think it does play into their decision when they're looking for a new church.
Yeah, I think that's right. And what do you think about that, Katie?
Yeah, I appreciate, Hannah, that you led with, and it makes my heart happy to know that when people are looking for churches, that they are looking for something that's gospel-centered, something, as we like to say in our Lutheran circles, that we'll hear both the law and the gospel. And just something, from what I've heard from my peers and from, my parents' friends and their children, that goes back to being real and being authentic. Again, buzzwords that I don't like to use because I think they've kind of been stripped of their value, but it's true, and we don't want to necessarily be sold on something. We just want to see you being you, the church being the church doing what we have been called to do, to seek the lost and strengthen the saved. And and kind of a more practical thing is that, as Hannah said, many are moving away from family and friends and those known roots or established relationships. And so I think a lot of times we're looking for that family, for that feel, to know, oh my goodness, I'm sick and my mom is 500 miles away, but I know that Mrs. Jones can bring me soup.
Yeah, when my wife and I moved to college, we started going to a church where we lived, and we kind of both felt homesick, and we had a family from our church that kind of took us in and became like our family away from family. So yeah, I think that's right. I know that I think millennials it's such a wide age of people, and there's so many life changes happening in that age group, especially right now, that like it's so diverse what they could be looking for. Like Hannah, like you said, when I'm looking for a new church, because I just moved recently, we looked for things like biblically sound and had a they preach the gospel and things like that. But then we also have a 1-year-old and a 2-year-old, so we had to throw that into the mix. And we wanted to find some place that actually cares for our kids and wants to help them grow. So it's just such a huge range of things that millennials could be looking for.
Mm-hmm.
We do have a question on Twitter that kind of goes along with this topic. Which, by the way, if you have a question, go to Twitter and use the hashtag CTSPanel, and we'll try to get your questions answered. But the question is, how do millennials view the old guard? Should we even try integration, or should we start planting new churches for them? What are you guys' thoughts on that? Let's start with Katie.
I think this is totally my knee-jerk reaction would be no, we shouldn't start planting new churches. I think that one of the things that I appreciate, or I shouldn't say we shouldn't start planting new churches, out of context, specifically for millennials. That's what I'm saying. We should be expanding or sharing the gospel, but we specifically planting a new church for one. I'm looking on Twitter to check out this question just to make sure I read it right. Yes, should we try integration? I would say yes. And by integration, if I guess I see that as learning and growing together. I think I know that I have learned a lot from previous generations and have been affirmed in what I have brought to the table by those generations as well. And I think that that can be a very valuable thing. Hey, it's Daniel!
Okay, thank you, Buffy. Bye.
You're welcome. Thank you.
All right, what'd I miss? I'm sorry, everybody.
I made it. Sorry, we had some trouble getting you in here. So right now we're talking about, we had a question from Twitter come in, and the question is, how do millennials view the old guard, and should we even try to integrate, or should we start planting new churches for them? But before I have you answer that, Daniel, why don't you just tell everybody who you are and what you do and how you relate with millennials or how you work with them.
My name is Daniel Ross. I am a pastor in Topeka, Kansas. So that's who I am and what I do. How I relate to millennials, I'm kind of right on the older edge of millennials. I was talking with a friend, and he described us as grandfather millennials. So that's kind of where I am. How I work with millennials, I mean, they're a part of my congregation, obviously, and then with high schoolers and even confirmands, just working with them as I work with anybody in my congregation, I would say.
Are there any differences that you like, stark differences with working with millennials than with, say, older or younger generations?
I would say there are, and that's just because of the generational differences within. Mainly, I try to use less sarcasm working with millennials, and that's when we get to a question later on, one of the questions, I can probably go into that further. Try to give them some ownership and some integration within the congregation. They like being with the whole congregation, not necessarily segregated in age groups all the time. So trying to figure out ways to do that, to have more what you might call multi-generational or even more family-style ministries as what we've been slowly implementing at my church.
So
whereas older members, you can be a little bit more sarcastic with, because they don't. Again, I'll gets into something later on, but yeah.
Yeah, well, you're really answering the question that was on Twitter that we're talking about right now. It's that, should we try to integrate millennials? And your thought is yes, we should. But how does that look in real life? What ways do you integrate them on a practical level?
Well, I think one of the things is you have to integrate them into the leadership of the church. That you have to, actions speak louder than words. And so if you sit there and, I hate using the old guard term, but if it's just the older generations that make up all the leadership of the church, then other generations, whether they be Gen Xers or millennials, aren't going to feel like they have a voice. And so finding ways to put them in positions of leadership, whether that's on boards or chairpersons of councils or even elders. I think it helps that I'm a pastor and I'm a millennial. I'd say that kind of speaks for a lot of leadership in the church. Being very intentional about it, searching them out, working with them, walking along beside them, because just because you want to put millennials in positions of leadership doesn't mean that they're necessarily ready to be there, and so you have to, use judgment on that. But then also kind of creating the sense of community, the sense of home, that this is a body of Christ and not a demographic of Christ, so to speak.
Yeah. Katie go ahead, Katie.
Piggybacking off of what Daniel said, some, whether they're millennials or what the upcoming generation is, building into that leadership, mentoring, I think, is a huge asset and something that we can really leverage and find a lot of strength in. That's, I think, one of the reasons that I'm so involved and passionate about church work and vocation and building up people, is because I had that growing up. I had not only my parents, but leaders in the church that when I would have a question or an idea would take me seriously. They, it might not, oh yeah, we're going to do that 100%, but sometimes they did, and that was very, I think, helpful in that actions speak louder than words, like Daniel emphasized.
And what about you, Hannah? What do you think is a good way to get millennials involved?
Yeah, I agree with everything that Daniel and Katie said. I think the main thing, like they both pointed out, is just engaging them and involving them. I know we kind of touched on this a little earlier, but I think people are kind of hesitant to involve millennials because they think that we're young and inexperienced. But I think we offer unique perspectives, and even if they're different, and like Katie had said earlier, if we get into this discussion of why we do things the way we do, then it really just kind of brings the whole church together, and we kind of have this one understanding, and we're on the same page. And I think that's so valuable, is just making sure that we are the body of Christ, like Daniel said, and we're all one, and just making sure that we understand each other and where we're all coming from is really, really important.
Yeah, I think it's easy for church leaders to not want to put millennials in areas of leadership because they think they're maybe not as mature yet. But the only way to learn is to do it and to make mistakes. And churches need to find ways to allow millennials to make those mistakes and to learn from them within reason, because you don't want the church to fall apart. But giving them a space to grow, I think, is a really good thing. We had another question on Twitter that ties into this a little bit. It's, what kind of resources do you think would be helpful for the church to provide to millennials? So Daniel, does your church use any specific resources that help millennials really fit in and be integrated?
We don't have any specific resources. I don't know if there's actually really a lot out there for that. I think integration is actually much more. It can't necessarily be a resource type thing. It's a people thing, and so searching them out, inviting them to things, going to where they're at, and things like that. That's how you integrate. That's how you. It's assimilation as you would have with any people group. That you have to go where they are, and so, yeah.
Yeah. Katie, what do you think about that? Do you agree?
Yeah, I think it's definitely a culture shift thing, and in a world where not just millennials, but all generations are now used to this almost instant gratification thing. Culture shift is kind of hard. I know, and I say that for myself more than more than anyone. But just that those attitudes and just those little things like starting to, if you don't already have the practice, maybe you ask somebody to come over for Sunday dinner or run to the coffee shop after church and talk about what went on, what you talk about the lessons, talk about the sermon, talk about Bible study, those little implementing those kind of cultural changes. As far as resources go about just what we believe, and definitely as Lutherans, I don't know if this is this is allowed, but a CPH product plug here. I've started reading Being Lutheran. I just got that a couple of days ago in the mail, and I think that does an excellent job and could speak to any age about that because it's timeless.
So you think maybe there's not a ton of resources specifically for millennials, but just resources that help them understand why they believe what they believe and things like that?
Yes. Engage, again, that conversation, engaging in that and using maybe resources that aren't targeted at millennials, but that culture. Yeah.
Hannah, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think a lot of people in the church think that to engage millennials you need like video sermons or like snazzy marketing Bible studies and these things that millennials might be open to, but again, like Katie and Daniel were saying, it's all about engaging. You don't need, I don't think anyway, those kind of expensive fancy resources that are maybe not going to really engage people if you don't have the relationship behind it. So I think that honestly the most important thing is just forming those relationships and then, just digging into God's Word together. That's really the thing that I think millennials care about, is just learning more about Jesus and the Bible. And so I don't think you necessarily need these resources specifically geared at millennials because, like Katie said, the Bible is timeless. So
if I could follow up, I would say if you kind of want to understand millennials, one, Hannah's ebook is a nice short primer for that, so just a little plug for that. But then also like Souls in Transition and Lost in Transition, and I forget the second book that's a part of that series, but these were very in-depth longitudinal studies specifically with this age group, and it deals with what formed them, how they view the world, and things like that. So if you're dealing with older generations in your church that are just struggling, okay, so how can I reach out to them because I don't know where they're at, I don't know where they think, I would direct you to Hannah's book and also those books because that's gonna be a glimpse to their worldview, which is really kind of the starting point of engagement, is understanding how people think and view the world.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning the ebook. I forgot to say that at the beginning, but this whole topic kind of stemmed out of an ebook that Hannah's written, and it's titled Millennials in the Church. And at the end of this presentation, we'll have a link to download that ebook, and you should also receive it in your email if you're watching this. But you can always go on our website, and like I said, the link will be up at the end. But yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. So, again, if you have questions, head over to Twitter and use the hashtag CTSPanel, and we'll try to keep answering those. So, speaking of technology, churchgoers often assume that technology needs to be infused into church in order to attract millennials. Do you agree with that perception? Why or why not? Hannah, let's start with you. What do you think about this question?
I think the best way I can explain this is just the idea that I think millennials are more accepting of technology in the church, right? Like having a screen in the church or doing online giving or having the pastor read the Bible out of an iPad or something. I think millennials are more accepting of that, but I don't think it's necessarily a deciding factor in what attracts them to a church. You know, like if a pastor does use an iPad or if he has a screen up during worship with a PowerPoint, they're not going to see anything wrong with that, but they're not going to base their whole decision on where to go to church on that. And so I think the biggest thing, like we've been saying this whole time, is just that millennials are more than, they don't want to be entertained, like Katie said. You know, we want to be involved and engaged, and we want to learn about God's Word. And so I think that's the biggest thing, is not focusing so much on and relying on technology to just act like a magnet to millennials, because it's not going to.
Daniel, any thoughts on that?
No, I completely agree with what Hannah said. Millennials can be surprisingly cynical, and so they can see through if you're just throwing a whole bunch of fancy presentations but there's no substance, because they've grown up with PowerPoints, they've grown up with presentations in school and things like that. So they're looking for substance. They're not looking for style.
Yeah, so if you have a really cool Prezi presentation, but it's not filled with anything meaningful to me, maybe I'll tune it out.
Exactly, yeah, and if you know, if that's a church, then I'm not going to come back to that church the next week. I'm going to go find another church that actually is dealing with God's Word in depth and in a real way, whether it has screens or not.
Yeah. Katie, what do you think on this subject?
I would echo what's been said. There's so much technology in our lives that we're kind of discerning, I don't know if that's the right word, about what we choose to take in and how it's used, but definitely substance over style. But I guess I would like to add that the style does serve the substance to a degree, and so when we do technology, let's do it well, and that includes substance and layout. And Daniel mentioned, I think, and Hannah as well, we've grown up with PowerPoints, and we've seen a lot of PowerPoints, and I would say maybe the minority of them are wonderful. Because PowerPoints, I think, can be used very well. When used most effectively, they have that. They have the point, or the thing, a point to make you, to jump off on, or to summarize, but they don't have the content. We want to hear that from you, or something in that way. If that makes any sense. Sorry. I'm open to clarifying questions on that.
Maybe in your PowerPoints avoid the George Lucas wife transitions. I think those are a little overused.
Yeah, I think that there should be a mandatory PowerPoint class if you're going to put PowerPoint. I've seen a lot of bad presentations over the years, and it's kind of like, you know, if you're used to a flat screen, high definition 4K TV, and then your friend comes in and says, "Oh, we're going to watch the Super Bowl," and he pulls out like a 13-inch black and white, it's going to affect how you watch the Super Bowl. So, you know, part of that communication is making sure that you're not interfering with the message you're trying to communicate. So.
And the same, I would say, goes for print media as well. We want to, like, we scour our bulletins, and yes, there's going to be a misplaced comma and, you know, things here and there. Sometimes a word might be left out, but we try to keep that to a minimum, because we don't want that to be a distraction from people hearing God's Word and seeing that.
And I'm not too sure. When I talk with some millennials, I would say there's a segment that are looking for a place that is technology free. You know, they have their phones all the time. I mean, they have screens in front of them more hours out of the day than anybody else. And so a place that doesn't have those screens, a place that isn't always super flashy every 30 seconds, but forces them to focus and things like that, those places are still wanted and needed.
Yeah, kind of going off of what Daniel said, I read an article or something a while ago, and it said that millennials, like, the church can't compete with what the world has to offer for entertainment. Like, millennials can get their phones and their TVs and the internet and everything from the outside world, and the church can offer that real substance. And so that's what makes the church different, is that they don't have to be flashy and stuff because they have that real substance.
Yeah, maybe we don't have the biggest pop stars, although Justin Bieber is getting pretty involved in church, but we do have Jesus, so I think that's what we need to lead with.
Justin Bieber might be a barrier to older generations. No offense if you're watching, Justin Bieber.
I'm sure he is.
Jesus loves you too.
So, speaking of millennials' worship styles, another assumption is that millennials will only attend churches that have contemporary worship. Is that a legitimate assumption? Why or why not? Hannah, why don't you kick us off with this one?
I think a lot of millennials are more open to contemporary worship, and there are a lot of millennials who do prefer contemporary worship, but I also have friends who like vehemently oppose contemporary worship. Like, they will only attend like a more traditional or a liturgical style service. So I think it's kind of unfair to assume that all millennials want like this concert experience with like the lights and the band and the stage. I think that millennials are more accepting of it, but I also think it's unfair to kind of lump all millennials together and think that having a contemporary service will draw in millennials, because I mean, I don't want to like beat a dead horse, but like we've been saying this whole time, what really matters to millennials is the relationships that they're going to form with people, and the fact that they want to learn and they want to have that solid belief in the grounding in the Bible. And so I think that millennials might prefer the contemporary worship, but you can't rely on that to just kind of make all these millennials come out of the woodwork.
Yeah. Actually, going off of that, millennials coming out of the woodwork, we had a question on Twitter that said, in a semi-rural area with limited millennials for others to connect to, how can we keep this limited group growing? So what are some ways you can pull the millennials out of the woodwork, if not, flashy screens?
Well, I'm from a semi-rural area, so I totally identify with you, whoever you are on Twitter. And I know that there is not a lot of millennials that go to church. It's kind of rare to have a lot of young people, especially rural churches. And so I think honestly, with the few millennials that you do have, you really have to encourage them to form relationships with each other, but you also have to encourage everybody else in the congregation to be intentional about forming relationships with them as well. And then, millennials are going to be the best people to encourage other millennials to come to church. So, encouraging their friends or their coworkers or their roommates or whatever to come to church, and that's really going to be valuable, but then the whole congregation also has to reach out to millennials as well.
Katie, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that engaging those, the millennials to connect with peers, but also to connect with peers in a larger setting. So we love potlucks at my church, which is probably not surprising to many. But I think that one of the things that I love about that is that, yes, I am with people my own age there, but I am also with people not my own age, and it is just that family experience. I think I just keep going back to that. Like Hannah said, sorry to beat a dead horse, but yeah, that is huge.
Daniel, do you have any thoughts on how to get millennials to come to your church?
Yeah, and I want to back up a little bit and just talk about the contemporary worship real fast. The studies that I've seen, it's about 50-50 of millennials preferring contemporary worship or traditional worship. So assuming that you have one style of worship is going to attract millennials is not really a great assumption. And just really playing off what Hannah and Katie said about attracting millennials, millennials are they're very wary about institutions and organizations, whether it's a company or even a church. You know, they approach advertisements and those things as, okay, so what are you trying to get out of me? But word of mouth, if it's coming from their friend, so if you have a millennial in your church and very welcoming and open and you know that they have a good time, they enjoy it, you have a rich, deep, authentic Christ message, you know, our Lutheran heritage, which is all about Christ, they're going to tell their friends. And that word of mouth is trusted over any kind of advertisement or anything you're going to have. So it's really about making those connections, making those relationships, and like Katie said, family, family, family. You know, the body of Christ, the family of Christ. That's what millennials are looking for. And so being very intentional about being a community of believers, and whether you have to teach what that looks like, but however it is, you have to get it across. You have to get it across to the congregation, without also going to the opposite extreme and saying, okay, we're just all about millennials, and then forgetting every other generation out there too. I mean, there's that tension there within church that you have a wide generational gap right now, and you have to reach both generations. So you can't sacrifice necessarily doing ministry to older generations just to focus on millennials also at the same time. So it's that tension there, which we're famous Lutherans having paradoxes and things like that, that you really have to find that line with. And it's different for every church, every community, every congregation.
Yeah, and I'm right there with you. If I feel like someone's trying to sell me something, I'll like reject it and stay away from it. But if I feel like, or if I hear from someone else that there's a church that just cares for people and gets into the Word and is faithful, that's the kind of church that draws me in. Whereas if they're trying to attract me by doing something like having flashy lights or a cool praise team or something, that's not as exciting to me, I guess. Let's see. So what struggles do millennials have, and how can the church help with those struggles? Hannah, why don't you start this out? What struggles do millennials have?
I think the biggest struggle that millennials have, along with everybody else in the church really, is just living in this culture of acceptance and tolerance where, you know, our society wants us to accept everybody for who they are, and, you know, you can believe what you want, but as long as it doesn't affect me, then we're good. I actually just read this book called Good Faith, and it's all based on the idea that our society thinks that sharing your beliefs makes you an extremist in your religion. And so I think that's kind of the thing that we struggle with, is that a lot of millennials do want to share the gospel, and we want to engage with our friends who are maybe non-Christians, but, you know, we're afraid of offending people and stuff like that. And just how to confront these different worldviews and lifestyles that are present in our society, I think, is something that's really challenging for us. And so I think it's really important for the church to tackle these ideas head on and just be really open and honest about the difficult things that are happening in our society. And, you know, millennials, they don't want you to beat around the bush, right? Like, we're like the Twitter generation, like, tell us in 150 characters or less. So we don't want this kind of long, drawn-out explanation that doesn't really give us an answer. You know, we just want to know what we believe and how we can tackle it. And so I think it's really important for the church to just address these difficult topics head on. And, you know, it's going to be hard and it's going to be difficult and uncomfortable, but I think in the end it's going to make everybody stronger.
Katie, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, this idea that thank you for putting it that way, so kind of explicitly, Hannah, that sometimes if we express a belief that we have, and even in a very kind and loving way, it can be taken a completely different direction. And there's a reason, I think, as much as when it was written as it applies to us today and has throughout the time in between, that in Second Peter or First Peter, it's bad that I forget, we're told to share the hope that we have with gentleness and respect. And people can twist that however they like, but that's what we're called to do. We're still called to give an answer for the hope that's in us with gentleness and respect, and that's a huge struggle to find that balance.
Yeah. Daniel, what struggles do you see millennials having, and how can the church help with those?
Well, I go back to that the final book in the series, Lost in Translation, that deals with all the things that millennials really are struggling with. And a couple of years ago, in St. Louis, I can't remember if it's like the youth symposium or what, youth workers, they came in, and I was a youth pastor at the time, and so I went to it, and two of the authors of that book, two of the ladies that wrote that book, they were the presenters, and that's what they were talking about. And the one thing that really struck me was there is this sense of a loss of place, this sense of a loss of home. And they were talking about this, and it kept on coming up, and at one point they were talking about how as these the people that you follow, I forget what they're called, as they were aging out of the study, the participants were aging out of the study, it'd be like the last time they talked with them, and more than just a few would just break down in tears, whether the conversation was in person or over the phone, because they thought the only person that cared for them were these researchers. These are people with brothers and sisters and moms and dads and communities, and yet there was this disconnect with that. And I think that plays in also, one of the things is that they have a really hard time with interpersonal in-life communication. It's really easy to text and Twitter and direct message and all that, but talking somebody face-to-face is difficult. So I think what they really struggle with the most, just my personal view, is they're struggling to find a place to belong. They're struggling to find a place that loves them. And I think that's why there is that huge push in this identification with acceptance movements, because they want to feel accepted. Whether that doesn't necessarily mean that they don't want people to help them change or be better people, but they want to feel that there's a place that they can call home. They want to feel that there's a place that they can know they can go to, and people will care for them. And I believe the church is a great place for that. I really believe that as we kind of shift some of our evangelism towards millennials, what we're really going to have to emphasize is not necessarily what it is we're for and what it is that we're against, but this community, this body of believers, this place that you can come to and people care for you because Christ died for you. And if Christ loves you, at the very least, I have to love you too. And that's not like a mandatory thing, but it's I get to love you also. Yeah. I get to be involved in your life, and you get to be involved in my life. And I'm just so excited that you're here, and I hope you're excited that I'm here too.
Yeah, I agree with that. So when I think about millennials and their struggles, I think of things like how do you live faith in your life, or how do I parent like a Christian should. And I think the best way for the church to support millennials is to just model those things. Just spend time with millennials as an older generation. Spend time with millennials and show them how you live out your faith in your life, and show them how you parent like Christ, and just be a model for them, and be open to sharing your life with them.
I can't remember if it was Hannah or Katie, so I apologize, but one of them mentioned mentoring. And that's, that plays right into that, I think, Andrew, that mentoring aspect of connecting millennials with older generations in kind of a mentoring relationship, or you might even call them a foster parent relationship, so to speak.
Yeah. I think also playing into the how can the church help with those struggles, as Hannah and Danielle have mentioned, this idea of meaning and belonging and fulfillment, and we know that we have that in Christ. That as Daniel said, he died for us. He loves us that much, and that he also uses us to share that love with others. And so I love vocation, and how much more involved could you get than God wants to work through you, and is working through you. And that being Lutheran, we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. So.
Yeah. Well, we've got one last question that I want to get to, so let's move on to that. So how can churches support and engage millennials once they're part of the congregation? So once you get them in your doors, what can you do to support them? And Hannah, why don't you start this one?
I think you kind of answered the question in the question. I think how you support and engage them is you support them and you engage with them still. Like after you get them in the door, you have to continue building those relationships, and you have to continue to, like Katie said, ask them to Sunday dinner or to go to coffee or, to babysit their kids or something. Like, just continue engaging with them, and really forming those relationships is, I think, really the only thing that you can do to help support millennials, is just recognize that they're people and that they crave relationships and that they want to grow and that they want to learn, and just to continue that and to be kind of that mentor figure, I think, is invaluable.
Mm-hmm.
Daniel, any thoughts?
I totally agree with Hannah, and again, I think it kind of goes back to what we were talking about with the last question of kind of that mentorship, being involved in their life, showing care and support. So if that means helping them by babysitting, or having a college student over for dinner, or even not even a college student, but somebody who's out of college but not necessarily married yet, or things like that, or a young couple, making them a part of your life. Ministry is not just done by the professionals. Ministry is done by the whole congregation, and so the whole congregation kind of has to incorporate that. I mean, they're supposed to be ministering to each other just as much as a pastor or a DCE or deaconess or whatever acronym it might be. Would be ministering to them also.
Yeah, that's awesome. And Katie, do you have any thoughts to add to it?
Yeah, I think the only thing that I would say is, as well as investing in millennials, allow them to invest in you. I love there are people that I can ask a question just to get to know them and to know what they value, and that builds that relationship and that connection very much, and just a place that where this realness is, and we can say, as we do at the beginning of each service, that we are poor, miserable sinners, but then we hear those beautiful words of forgiveness and reconciliation, and that brings us together as a community. And there's something so healing in that brokenness, and then that healing, and together especially.
Yeah. We had a couple questions on Twitter that tie in with this. They asked, how do we engage millennials in a Bible study or a ministry if they're not part of our congregation? So we talked about what to do if they're in your congregation, but if you don't have a lot of millennials in your congregation, but you have a lot of millennials around you, how do you engage with them?
Something, and I couldn't give you statistics on how effective this is, but if you're a pastor or a DCE, try working at a coffee shop. I don't mean like behind the counter, but we have laptops, we have books, although I might like to be a barista someday. But just camp out there. You'll see the same faces, recognize people. I've heard some really cool stories from peers, from colleagues in the field, about how they built relationships in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. Hannah, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think if you're trying to reach millennials who aren't members of your congregation, I think it's really even more important to be very open and honest during that Bible study. Like if you have millennials who are interested in becoming a part of a small group or becoming a part of a Bible study, it's really important to just be open and honest during that time and just, really dig into God's Word and just focus on the gospel and, continue to support and engage them even though they're not members of your congregation. I think that, like we keep saying, relationships are so important to millennials, and so I think just kind of forming those relationships with them as well.
Daniel, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think that if you're starting with how do we get them into Bible study, not necessarily the first question. I mean, you skipped a couple steps there. If you don't necessarily have millennials in your church, but they're around you, just how do you get them in church in the first place? And I think part of that is that you have to go to where they are at. So whether that means you asking your pastor to, hey, can you spend like Thursday afternoon working on your sermon at Starbucks instead of locked away in the office, or something like that. But then in this, a lot of people don't like to do this because it's extremely awkward, but I have heard amazing stories from this of doing something that's called a prayer walk. So if you have millennials that are living around you, getting members to go walk down the street, knock on doors, and it's not, you're not saying, hey, if you die tonight, where are you going to wind up? It's not the Kennedy method here. It's just saying, hey, we're from such and such church, and we just want to know if there's anything we can do for you or pray for you, either right now or hopefully right now, but or even within our congregation. Showing that you care, reaching out to them first, because if you're waiting for them to walk through the doors, it doesn't matter how you advertise your programs or things like that. You're putting the cart before the horse. You have to go where they're at. They're not going to come to you.
Yeah, that's a great thought. I really like the idea of the prayer walk. I can see how maybe some people might think it's difficult, especially if you're introverted. But I think if you get out and you do it, that it probably would be a pretty good thing for your church and to get millennials into your church, or even just people in general. So we've made it through the questions. Do you guys have any final thoughts that you'd like to share? Give us some wisdom about millennials. Katie, let's start with you.
I guess for millennials, as much as anyone, just continue to give us Jesus. That's what we need in this broken and crazy world. And he works through different ways, but we know for sure that as he's promised, he comes to us in his word and sacrament. And yeah, give him Jesus, build relationships. That's
Yeah, absolutely. And Hannah, what do you think?
Yeah, I think the only other thing I could add is just don't be scared to interact with millennials. I think some people are kind of scared because they don't know us very well, and they kind of think that we're these like young, scary, technologically savvy people. But just engage with us and just relate to us, and we're pretty friendly, I think. So just kind of, like we've been saying the whole time, just build relationships with us and value us as people. And like Katie said, give us Jesus. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Daniel, final thoughts?
I think they nailed the. I think they nailed it. Hit the whatever it's called. Hit the nail on the head. There we go. Just give them Jesus. Word and sacrament ministry. The Lutheran buzzwords. Law and gospel. But again, they both mentioned this, and I'm going to mention it again. If you take one word away from this, relationships, relationships, relationships. Showing that you care, showing that you're involved, and not being afraid to talk to them, and not being afraid to invite them into your life, and having a two-way street there instead of just a I'm going to tell you how life is type thing, but let's go through this together type mentality.
Yeah. So I think the general consensus is if you want to do ministry with millennials, be in relationship with them and give them Jesus. Does that sound right?
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. I hope this conversation is a meaningful one for you and your congregation, and that you can use some of these thoughts and resources to start a conversation at your own congregation about how do we do ministry with these this new generation. And if you would like Hannah's ebook, which I would really advise you get if you're interested in doing ministry with millennials, visit our website at concordia.tech/millennial ebook, and you can get your copy of it there. And that goes into a lot of the things we talked about today, but maybe into a little more detail. So check that out. You can feel free to share this video with anyone in your congregation, and just keep the conversation going. So thank you everyone for joining us, and we hope to hear from you soon. All right, thanks everyone. Bye.
Bye.